Approaches, methods and techniques of teaching English. This unit covers and deals with the three important concepts of English language teaching. One, approach, the second one, method, and the third one, techniques of teaching English. Every English teacher should know the three important words. They are approaches, methods and techniques. These three terms are interrelated and they have the similarity as well as they are used in the contrast meaning also. Every teacher of English should come across the three important terms, that is approach. The first one we take up, approach. In this we discuss various components of approach. What is an approach? What are the different components of an approach, or the scope of approach? The differences between approach and method, what are the differences we find while coming into the discussion? And the fourth point we discuss an overview of well-known approaches in the language teaching. And we also discuss, do approaches help the teachers of English? Is there any super approach of all these approaches? These are some of the important areas. Certainly every teacher of English should know the concept. Objectives of this unit. Yes, we discuss the following points in this unit to understand the different approaches and how they inspired and impacted the teaching process, teaching and learning process in India in the 20th century and 21st century. As we know that in the era of globalization, every English teacher, every language teacher should have a clarity and a good command over these approaches. And the second objective of our unit is critically analyze and discuss the advantages of each approach. Namely, we have four approaches. 1. Structural approach. 2. Oral and situational language teaching. 3. Audio-lingual approach. And the fourth one, communicative approach. These four are the major approaches of language teaching. And then we will also discuss how different approaches are used to enhance the teaching learning process in the language classroom. Certainly, we should follow the principles of the approaches. Yes, when we talk about approach, what do you mean by approach? How does it work? See, approach establishes a relation between the theory and the practice of language teaching. Theory and the practice of language teaching. First time in the history of language teaching, this term was introduced by Anthony E.M. in the year 1965. Especially in US and UK, there was a lot of research done on the different approaches. Yes, we know, the teachers of English, that every teaching activity happens in the society, and certainly that reflects the various practices and the principles of the contemporary society. And an approach also sticks and holds the knowledge and beliefs of the society that holds. An approach is an overall plan of language teaching and learning process. It's an overall plan. It's a whole process. What do you mean by overall plan? When we talk about overall plan, a plan that covers each and every activity is known as overall process or overall plan. An approach is a whole process that deals with each and every activity of the teaching and learning process. See, teaching and learning are interrelated, not isolated one. Learning and teaching can be done through the interactive mode. While taking up the teaching learning activity, approach is an important phenomena. Certainly, it inspires the language learning and teaching language learning process. Every approach deals with and also focuses on the theories and the nature of language. When we talk about the language theories, certainly we should recollect that Indo-European family of languages is mother of all languages. All Indian languages, Iranian languages and the many other languages are derived from a family known as Indo-European family. Yes, when we talk about Max Muller's language theory, poo-poo theory, ding-dong theory, ho-yo-sho theory, all the theories talk about how the sounds are evaluated, how the sounds are originated from a set of principles. Certainly, sound is a basic unit of language. Approach deals with the theories of these theories, what we have mentioned now, and also nature of language. What do you mean by nature? It talks about the character of the language. Language has certain characteristics, like language is reflexiveness, language is arbitrary, language follows the duality of structures, language follows interchangeability, language has redundancy, language has creativeness. See, these are the characteristics features of the language. Approach deals with the theories as well as the nature of the language, and then every approach describes the principles, a set of principles and the nature of the subjects to be taught, nature of the subject. For example, I want to make my learners to teach English. What are the principles I have to follow to make my learners to learn the language? Approach talks that. Approach talks about the principles and the nature of the subject to be taught in the classroom. And approach also tells us why and what form of English needs to be taught. What English is taught, what form of English is to be taught. For example, if I stick to the structural approach, I follow these certain structures in order to make my learners to learn the language effectively and efficiently. If I stick to oral and situational language teaching, certainly I follow those structures with the meaningful situations. If at all I follow the communicative approach and I use authentic material in order to make my learners to learn the language, to speak the language, to use the language well. That means it talks about why and what form of English to be taught. It concerns about, finally, approach concerns about what to teach. Yes, what to teach, what is to be taught in the classroom in order to make the learners to use the language. In the long journey of English language, there are many approaches that those inspired the English language teaching. And theory of language, as I said, approach deals with the theories of language. Yes, certainly every language is considered as a system of structurally related elements. Yes, language is viewed as meaningful structures, combination of structures. Yes, various dimensions, say for example, grammatical dimension is given importance while making the students to learn the language, and what needs to be taught while teaching English language, a language like English. Phonological units, phonology talks about sound segments, phono means sounds, phonology deals with the sounds, scientific production of the speech sounds in the language, and grammatical units and operations. Yes, we do follow the grammatical units and different operations in order to make the learners to learn the language. Lexical items lexical items that include spelling, word formation and everything. So these are the theoretical assumptions of language. Remember that every approach deals with two types of assumptions. One is linguistic assumptions, second one is psychological assumptions. These are linguistic assumptions. Linguistic assumptions means language is considered, of course, every language is considered a combination of meaningful structures. Language learning is done through the habit formation. This is known as linguistic assumptions. Yes. Where should we focus? Yes. And linguistic assumptions, psychological assumptions. Yes. Psychological assumptions means what? Providing the motivation, making the learners to be ready to face the situation. That means law of readiness. Law of readiness is an important principle of language learning. Yes. And besides the linguistic principles, functional meanings are also important in order to make the learners to learn the language. What dimension of language is prioritized? Yes, semantic or communicative dimension. We know that every language is a combination of 7 systems like syntax, semantics, phonology, morphology, orthography, lexicography, stylistics. Every language, that English language is a combination of these 7 parts. What needs to be taught? Functions and notions of the language needs to be taught. So focus, when we talk about focus of teaching, certainly functional meaning is important for this. Yes, let me tell you what are the difference between approach, method and technique. Yes, what are the difference between approach, method and technique? These three are interrelated. Yes, look at the map, we find the difference between approach is whole, a whole one that talks about language theories, language habit formation and nature of language. And come to the method, method is a way of teaching that talks about a set of principles. And come to the technique, technique is part of method. Yes, different theories about the nature of language and how languages are learnt. It is dealt by the approach, right? What does approach say? Approach deals with, or approach says about the language theories and also the nature of language. The second one, method. Method deals with different ways of teaching language, like it follows presentation, practice, production and repetition. It follows 4 principles. Every method is a set of principles. It deals with how to teach. Approach deals with what to teach and method deals with how to teach. Come to the last and the small part in this 3 is technique. Yes, technique is an effective management, an effective tool of classroom management. Techniques are used to accomplish the immediate objectives of the classroom. Yes, every teacher should know some techniques in order to make the classroom effectively and lively. Come to the plan, approach is whole. Yes, when we look at the diagram, approach is a whole and method is part of approach and a technique is part of method. Yes, in other words, an approach may have number of methods, a method may have number of techniques. This is the interrelation between approach, method and a technique. See, technique always restricted to the classroom. It looks into the classroom environment, it looks into the classroom management, and methods are the devices that are used how to teach. And approach always talks about theories language theories and a set of principles and how languages are learnt in the world. At a glance, when we look at these three words, approach deals with what to teach. You are a teacher of English, what to teach? Yes, approach tells us what to teach. You have to teach structures, you have to use situations, you have to teach audiolingual thing, audiolingual skills, use audiolingual skills to teach. Yes, approach deals with what to teach. And come to the method, method deals with how to teach. Whether you use both languages or you restrict yourself to the target language only, or you follow the reading method, or you follow the translation of the target language into the mother tongue of the learners. Yes. The finally technique deals with how a thing is done in the classroom. Technique is a small device that shows the effective management of the classroom. Techniques are used to make the classroom actively and lively. Yes. Among these approaches, we have the first approach, that is the structural approach. Basically, we have four approaches. Structural approach, first one, oral and situational language teaching. Second one, audio-lingual approach. The third one, communicative approach. The fourth one. First, we take of this approach, that is the structural approach. Yeah. Structural approach is the first approach of the language learning world. It was invented during the time of Second World War. American government asked the language scholars to come up with a new approach in order to make the learners to learn the language effectively. To that challenge, the challenge was done by the US government. As an answer to the challenge, the two language scholars, their names were Charles Fries and Robert Lado, brought this approach. So, Charles Fries and Robert Lado are considered as fathers of structural approach. Yes, they invented and popularized this approach. Certainly, structural approach was influenced by the structural linguists of the 20th century and 21st century. 20th century basically. Structural linguist, what do you mean by structural linguist? Yes. In the world we can find the two schools of philosophy that contribute the language learning. One is structural linguist, other one is sociolinguist. Structural linguists believe that language learning is possible by using the meaningful structures. Yes, structural linguists believe that language learning is possible by getting command over the meaningful structures. But whereas sociolinguists believe that language is learned based on the needs, based on the background, in the natural environment. Here, Charles Fries and Robert Lado are structural linguists. They are the structural linguists and they strongly argued that language learning is possible based on the structures. They used almost 250 structures in order to make the learners to learn the language effectively. Yes, structural approach is intended that, yes, it deals with the ability to master the structures. Students are given the number of structures and oral drills are followed so that the students are expected to come out from the meaningful structures. Yes, it follows the principles of behavior psychology. Yes, in psychology, we talk about behaviorism and a cognitivism. It follows the behavioristic psychological principles. Yes, in the initial days, this structural approach is also known as SOS approach, structural, oral and a situational approach, structural and situational memorization approach, SOS approach and SSM approach. This talks about, this is also known as SOS or SSM approach. Yes, when we talk about the characteristic features of structural approach, yes, certainly it is a new approach that made the language learning easy. Meaningful structures should be selected while making the learners to learn the structures. Structures should be selected and graded carefully before presenting them. What do you mean by selection, or what do you mean by gradation? For example, I take 10 students out of 100, this is known as selection. If I put the 10 students in the rank wise or in the priority wise, it is known as gradation. Selection is done first, based on the selection, gradation is done. So, structure should be presented before presentation, they are to be selected and graded carefully. Yes, and this structural approach also believes that language is a set of structures or patterns. Yes, learning language means getting command over the structures. If you want to learn the English language, first you get the command over the language by using different structures like subject, verb 1, object. He goes to college every day. She reads the Hindu every morning. I like music. They follow the traffic rules. See the sentences: subject, verb 1 and object. The structure is subject plus verb 1 plus object. The students are provided certain structures and they are to be asked to follow the oral drills, so that structures, learning the structures lead to the learning the language. Yes, language learning by using structures. Yes, simply it talks about language learning by using the structures. Yes, students learn the language by getting command and also continuous repetition of the selected structures. And it strongly believes, structural approach strongly believes that structure is important rather than the meaning. What do you mean by structure is important? Yes, structure is important means the students are expected to get command over the structures. Meaning is secondary, structure is primary, accuracy is given importance, fluency is later, accuracy is first. Structural approach believes that accuracy is first, then the fluency. Structural related elements. What are the structural related elements? Like syllables, words and structures are important in this approach. Syllable, what do you mean by syllable? Syllable is a word or part of a word that has a sound, maybe vowel sound or maybe consonant sound. Yes, students are expected to get command over the syllables, so that structural related elements are given importance in the structural approach. Yes, it based on a set of rules. Rules are very important rather than the usage. Charles Fries advised that the students should have a good command over the rules of the language. Yes. For this, a language scholar whose name was C.S. Bandari prepared almost all 250 structures to make the language learning easy. Yes, to make the language learning easy. Certainly, it talks about this following drills are useful in order to make the learners to learn the structures. Drills are so many types. Here we discuss the 6 types of drilling, oral drills. One is substitution table. Yes, we use substitution tables or substitution drills in the structural approach. The following drills are used in the structural approach in order to make the language learning possible, the language learning easy. Second one, the repetition drill. Substitution drills talks about language patterns, grammatical things. The repetition drill, repetition, that means production, continuously the language items are to be practiced. The third one, the additional drill. Yes, additional drill deals with the missing words. Yes, the teacher or the students are provided the drills that with that of the missing words. The fourth one, the transformational drill. Yes, it deals with sentences are given in the active voice. The learners are expected to change them into the passive voice. The fifth one, the concord drill. Concord means verb and agreement. In a sentence, the agreement between subject and a verb should be done properly. It talks about verb agreement drill or also concord. Sixth one, the chain drill. Forward or backward chain. Chain drill may be forward drill, forward chain or backward chain. Yes, going before front side is known as forward drilling, and coming to the back is known as backward drilling or backward chaining. Certainly this structural approach, yes, is important. What the points we have discussed so far? We discussed the structural approach and the definition of the structural approach and various characteristic features of structural approach and the drills that are used for the structural approach. Now I talk about the advantages of the structural approach. What are the advantages of the structural approach? Number one, it makes the language learning easy one. Yes. Before structural approach, language learning was considered as a difficult task, but after the structural approach, language learning is easy. Number two, it saves the time. Yes, students are easily learn the language because the structures are graded and selected so that they learn the language easily. It saves the time. Number three, yes, students get command over the structures. It improves the writing skills. Certainly, in the initial days of language learning, and certainly it was used as a master tool to use the language learning effectively. Yes, vocabulary is improved through the structural approach. Certainly, vocabulary is improved. Vocabulary and a various usage because the students are provided different drills so that they get clarity. And even in India, the structural approach was introduced in Madras University. Yes, structural approach was introduced in Madras University. And also the teachers that those believe in the structural approach, they conducted a national level meeting at Srinagar in order to discuss the structural approach. And the teachers of public schools are attracted to the structural approach. Structural approach certainly makes and the teachers and something teachers, they feel easy to learn, to make the learners to learn the language easy, and at the same time come to the negative aspect, other aspect of the structural approach. Yes, that means the disadvantages of the structural approach. Certainly, as we spoke now, structural approach stimulates the language learning process, but it has given a lot of negative results to the language learning world. Number one, It makes the language learning a dull and monotonous activity. Yes, it makes the language learning dull and a monotonous activity. Certainly the students depend on the structures. The second one, the second disadvantage of the structural approach is it gives importance to rote memory and by heart system. It encourages the rote memory techniques and also by heart system. The students are expected to have the structures by heart, and it discourages, number 3, it discourages the creativity and imagination in the language learning process. Students are not given much liberty, not given much scope to learn the language in the natural way. Number 4, it is an artificial approach. Yes. It restricted the language learning to the rules. Rules are important rather than the meaning. Meaning is secondary, rule is primary. So, it makes the language learning artificial, unnatural and unscientific. Some sociolinguists like Noam Chomsky criticized the structural approach very severely. It was so criticized by different language scholars. Of course, in continuation to the structural approach, one more approach has come as a reaction against the structural approach. In the beginning days, one more approach has come as a reaction to the structural approach, and that is oral and situational language teaching, OSLT. It is the second approach, oral and situational language teaching. Yes. And it was a reaction against the language learning. It was a reaction. It was popularized by two language scholars, Hornby and Harold E. Palmer. Two language scholars, their names were Hornby and Harold E. Palmer. Yes. What do you know about Harold E. Palmer? Harold E. Palmer was regarded as father of language skills. First time he put the language skills in the order, Harold E. Palmer. So, Hornby's contribution cannot be denied, and the contribution of Harold E. Palmer cannot be denied in the language learning world. Yes, these two language scholars have popularized the concept, the approach that is known as oral and situational language teaching. Frischby, one of the language scholars, Frischby, he talks about oral situational language teaching like this: word order of the structural words and a content words would form the material for teaching. Yes, word order of structural words and content words. What do you mean by structural words? Structural words are the words that are used to form the structure. All grammatical words are known as structural words. For example, articles, prepositions, auxiliary verbs, demonstrative pronouns, determiners are called the structural words in the language. These are known as the structural words. They are used to provide a link among the words in a sentence. And come to the content words. Content words are the words that convey the information, that convey the subject, like nouns, verbs, adjectives and adverbs. These four words are known as content words. Frischby says that word order of both the structural words and the content words, they form the material for teaching. Yes, and it also follows the psychological principles. It follows the psychological principles and behavioristic principles of educational psychology. Skinner, yes, B.F. Skinner talks about the behavioristic principles, operational condition theory, Skinner's psychology, Skinner's School of Education Psychology talks about the behavioristic principles. The behavioristic principles also deal with the habit formation theory. Yes, this approach depends on the habit formation theory, how the habits are formed. Certainly, the habits are formed through the continuous repetition. The habits are formed through the continuous repetition. If we do a thing continuously, that becomes a habit. Yes. If the students are provided the structures every day, certainly after a long drilling, they are able to use the structures because habit of speaking English is formed through the continuous repetition. It deals with the habit formation. Yes, habits are made, habits are formed. English language learning should be made as a habit. And the third approach, audio lingual approach. Certainly, yes, just we talked about, as I said, oral situational language teaching. It started as a reaction against the structural approach, but it did not fulfill the target because almost all the principles of oral and situational language teaching are same to the principles of structural approach. The advantages and disadvantages of structural approach are same like oral situational language teaching. Oral and situational language teaching did not give good results in the language learning process. Yes, sociolinguists criticized the oral situational language teaching. It also makes the language learning as an artificial one, an unscientific one. Yes, it also encourages rote memory and it also encourages by heart system. Yes, all the disadvantages of the structural approach can be seen in this approach also. It was started as a reaction against the structural approach. Finally, in fact, it was made as a continuation of structural approach, so that still there was unsatisfaction. Some of the language scholars were busy in the research in order to find out one more approach. Yes, certainly as a result of a long research done in the English language world, the third approach has come up, that is known as audiolingual approach. It took the ELT to the Second World War time. Yes, language learning was taken to the times of the Second World War. Yes, audiolingual approach. The title of the approach deals with audio means listening, lingual means speaking. This approach, audiolingual approach, gives importance to listening and speaking. Yes, language is learned through listening and speaking. These are the two important channels of the language learning. Yes, when we talk about the characteristic features of the audiolingual approach, 1. Language is primarily speech. Yes, the primary form of the language is spoken form. Yes, one should use the language if they want to learn the language, and it also emphasizes on practice, mimic and a memorization. Practice, we practice the language, we do mimic the language, and we memorize the language patterns. For this approach, dialogues are the important sources. Dialogues are important in order to learn the language. Dialogues. In the language learning laboratory, we listen to the dialogues and we try to reproduce the same dialogues after listening. Yes, language learning through listening and speaking. As I said, language learning is possible through listening and speaking. Yes, we listen to the language and we speak. Students are expected to sit in the language laboratory, and after listening to the dialogues, conversations, they are expected to practice what they listen to. Language laboratory is an important step of this approach. Yes, after Second World War, there was a lot of research done on the language learning. As a result, language laboratory is established under this approach. This is the most important characteristic feature of audiolingual approach. It supports the language laboratory. Under audiolingual approach, yes, a tremendous change had taken place, that is language laboratories were established. No particular language scholar, yes, has supported this. Almost all the contemporary language scholars, support this approach. Then finally, yes, when we talk about the communicative approach is an advanced approach. It talks about language learning for communication. It is a revolution against to the structural principles of language learning. Some of the language scholars were vexed by the way the language is taught, the way the language theories are being treated. Against to the structural principles of language learning, a language scholar whose name was Noam Chomsky brought this approach. Noam Chomsky wrote a book, Transformative Generative Grammar, in which he discussed the various principles of language learning. Yes, Noam Chomsky's ideas of language learning are much important, and they inspired the language learning world. Language learning is for communication. When we talk about the characteristic features of communicative approach, the first one is language is for communication. Why do we use the language? We use the language for communication. Language is a tool, a device to share the information, to pass the information from one to another. Through language only, we express our feelings, opinions, emotions and needs. So language is for communication, number one. Number two, language learning is natural and need based. Yes, it is natural. Language learning should be natural. But earlier approaches like structural approach, oral situational language teaching makes language learning unnatural. Yes. What does structural approach say? Structural approach says that language learning is possible by the meaningful structures. But against to the notions of structural approach, communicative approach believes that natural way of language learning. Yes. The students are given much importance, that means the learners are given much importance and liberty in the language learning. Need based, needs of the students are important rather than the structures. Yes, natural and it is need based. And language learning deals with a system of expression. Yes, language is a system of expression. What we feel, that should be expressed through a vehicle known as language. Communicative approach is very natural approach, and the practical approach, it talks about language is used as a system of expression. It is mother of invention. It is believed that necessity is the mother of invention. Yes, when the learners are provided need to learn the language, to use the language, certainly needs are important in order to learn the language. And a communicative approach believes in the child-centered methodology. Yes, now NCF also, National Curriculum Framework, NCF 2005, yes, talks about child-centered methodology and activity-based teaching. Now, in the state of Telangana, we use the approaches or methods or even textbooks are written in the light of National Curriculum Framework 2005, where the lessons are followed as child-centered methodology and deals with activity-based teaching. Yes, authentic material is used. What do you mean by authentic material? Authentic material is the general material that is used to teach language in the general way, like authentic material, for example, brochures, newspapers, journals, posters, magazines that are used for language teaching. A good teacher is one who uses authentic material. Of course, authentic material is not intended to teach English, but authentic materials are important to make the language learning interesting. It develops the creativity of the learners. It improves the ability because the students are provided the exposure that is related to the real life. Situations are given, real life situations are given importance. And one more characteristic feature of this approach is errors are the parts of learning. Yes, errors are very common. Yes, errors are very common. Students do the mistakes and they rectify the mistakes themselves. Yes, the teachers are expected to play the role of facilitator, monitor, or a role of mentor. Yes, errors are common while learning something. Errors are to be rectified. They are to be rectified by the teacher. Communicative approach is a revolution, yes, against to the structural principles of language learning. What Charles Fry spoke, what Hornby, Heraldi, Palmer spoke. They spoke about the structural way of language learning. Structures are important for language learning, but here Noam Chomsky talks about authentic material and the needs of the students are important for language learning. Errors are very common in the language learning process, so that the students are expected to overcome the errors gradually. Yes, examples must be real, real life examples must be used, and situations must be used. What do you mean by real life examples? Yes, the teachers are expected to give the examples that are related to the real life. Similarly, NCF also talks about this concept only. The examples that are used in the classroom must have a close relation with the society and also real life. If at all teacher uses the artificial examples, the children may not cope up or may not know the link between the example and the concept, so that real life examples should be used and even situations must be real. Yes, artificial situations give a half knowledge to the learners. If at all the situation is real, certainly the students can come up with a lot of experiences. See, real life examples and situations make the learners to be strong in the language learning, and they learn more and more activities and more and more language items in the natural way. And also it gives importance to creativity and imagination. Yes, communicative approach gives importance to creativity and imagination, whereas the structural approaches like structural approach and oral situational language teaching, they give importance to by heart system and rote memory. By heart system and rote memory are important, but here creativity and imagination is important. The students are expected to play a creative role. Yes, imaginative role. What teaching is? Teaching is something making the people to know of unknowing things. Knowing the unknown things, creative and imagination are always important in the learning process that leads to the qualitative learning. Communicative approach depends much on creativity and imagination. Yes, and also it is against the rote memory and by heart system. As I said now, it is against the rote memory techniques and also by heart system. No by heart. Students are not expected to by heart anything. Yes, they come up with their imaginative responses, and background, age group and the needs of the learners also important. Background, age group and needs of the learners are also important. Certainly, communicative approach is a remedy to all the existing evils of the classroom. It is a remedy to all the existing evils of the classroom. Yes, we have spoken about 4 important approaches so far, that is structural approach, oral situation language teaching and audio lingual approach and a communicative approach. Every English teacher should know the importance of approaches in the everyday discourse, in the everyday learning. As we know that teaching and learning are interrelated. A good teacher is one who has a good command over these approaches. And the fourth one, the communicative approach, undoubtedly it opens the avenues, it opens the gates for creative learning. Yes, communicative approach later it was developed and renamed as communicative competence by language scholar Hims, and later on many language scholars like Keith Morrow, Canale, Svein, Widdowson, Brumfitt and many other language scholars supported this approach. Keith Morrow has added 5 principles to the communicative competence. Yes, that is 5 principles. Keith Morrow's 5 principles of language learning are important in addition to this communicative approach. Yes, 5 principles. The first one is know what you are doing. Know what you are doing. Number 2, whole is important than the parts. Whole is important the parts. Number 3, process is as important as form. Process is as important as form. Number 4, to learn it and to do it. To learn it, to do it. Finally, mistakes are not always the mistakes. Mistakes are not always the mistakes. These are the 5 important principles of Keith Morrow, who discussed the 5 important principles of language learning to support the communicative competence. Further, this is about different approaches and different theories of language learning that inspired teaching and learning English.